comments and a little bit of discussion. So please make my life easy.
So just 1 minute left. Can we have all the mics except Judith's switch off? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Please, there are some microphones still on.
Okay. Shall we start? Okay. So for me in Montevideo is good morning. For several of you is good afternoon, even good evening to this third seminar in honoring Chris Freeman's 100th birthday. It is a seminar where young scholars will give some thoughts about how the work of Chris Freeman impacted their way of thinking, their decision about what to research and how to research. And all these young scholars have written texts that are now in innovation and development special issue. And when Gabriela Dutrénit and I thought about that, we wrote that perhaps the most important thing about Christopher Freeman was that he's an example of being devoted to values that we usually give for granted, but Chris Freeman did not give for granted. And if you allow me just to quote something that he wrote before starting that, he said, no economist, and I would say no social scientist, no academic at all, whether he's left-handed, right-handed, or ambidextrous, can possibly determine the ends of society in pursuing research and development. The really big choices in science policy, or in that part of science policy which goes under the heading of research and development policy, are political questions and political morale questions. And there is no economic magic formula to resolve these issues. I think that this is a strong, strong lesson that Chris Freeman left for all of us. And with this umbrella of thinking about the influence of Chris Freeman in our way of thinking, and particularly in the young scholars' way of thinking, we start this third seminar where we are going to have 4 young scholar presentation. It's interesting because 2 of the scholars are from countries where they live in, Peru and Argentina, and 2 young scholars are from countries where they are not now living in. And one is Rhiannon, that is working in Slavo in Sweden, and the other is Chen Li, Chinese, now studying in the south of Italy. Jana is Argentinian, living in Argentina, and Pavel is Peruvian, living in Peru. And they have a long and intensive academic working life, political life, institutional life. And I would like, if they want to make a more careful presentation of themselves, they can do it when they present the talks. Remember, the question is how Chris Freeman influenced their way of thinking. So without further ado, I give the floor to Chen, please.
Thank you, Professor. Greetings to you all. Actually, 10 years ago, I never could have imagined that one day I can dialogue with the master, crossing time and space through his work. For this, I will never forget the first time that I received a call for paper to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Christopher Freeman's birth. The year was 2020. Exactly, that moment aroused my curiosity about this very important economist. So, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful online seminar. Especially my gratitude to Professor Carlotte Perez, Professor Gabriela Dutrénit, Professor Judith Sutz, Professor Jana Schmutzler, the Globalix Board, and Innovation and Development Journal for your dedication to the growth of the younger scholars and your passion for Christopher Freeman, the sole mentor for guiding to write a new chapter in the new year. The study is motivated by the discussion proposed by Christopher Freeman and Perez in 1988 for the revival of the interest in long-term fluctuations and in the Schumpeterian theory of business circles. They explained the relationship of business circles and investment behavior, the structural crisis of the adjustment, and under the adjoint certain types of technical changes. This provided precise comprehension on the interaction mechanism between the three and the cause of the deeper structural crisis of adjustment. There was an urgent need of a long-wave theoretical explanation of this deeper structural crisis of adjustment by sharing a further comprehensive and in-depth understanding about the Schumpeterian theory of business circles. All show us that it is crucially important from a long-term dynamic perspective to seek truth from facts for studying the development of objective reality. The characteristic of the article lay not only in the clarity of the structure, but also in the author's fact-based comprehensive and demonstrative arguments. In particular, the debate against Katz's regression and neglect of technology was the most powerful and characteristic. Based on the law of facts, but also through the phenomenon of facts from a long-term dynamic perspective, this is an essential method to give a convincing explanation. And the method of comparing facts of the same phenomenon, namely the crisis of 1930s and 1980s, but of different essence, enables people to understand the deep real cause of the problem, like deeper structural crisis of adjustment in the growth of the world economy. Christopher Freeman upheld the truth in academic fields, tightly integrated the facts, kept pace with the times, and focused on the objective reality of the positive impact of technology and technology development on the world economy and mankind. In addition, from a more inclusive perspective, he attached importance to specific historical conditions and values to interpret the economic and social phenomena from the study of history and current situation. he was with accurate and profound insight into the laws of things and called for to solve problems from a long-term and qualitative aspect. Namely, it is extremely important to find common points and to identify the truth based on the fact in each historical period. This way of thinking of seeking common ground while reserving fact-based differences is used to solve problems, which has further pushed qualitative research to a new level. Or a vivid expression of the meaning of a soul mentor for guiding to write a new chapter in the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Dee, for your really interesting and deep reflection and your the recognition of the value of the qualitative approach of Freeman as a guidance for future research. Thank you very much. And now I would like to call Pavel to give his thought to us, please.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you everyone for giving me this chance to share with you my thoughts about the legacy of Chris Freeman and how his ideas influenced my research activities when I was doing my PhD. I studied centers of excellence in 2 Latin American countries, Peru and Chile. These centers of excellence have been promoted mainly in developed countries, and lately 3 Latin American countries launched similar initiatives. I am talking about Brazil in 2011, Chile in 2010, and Peru lately in 2014. These centers of excellence in these countries have specific characteristics compared to the developed world. One of these characteristics is that the program of centers of excellence required local actors to interact with international partners in order to have access to the global stock of knowledge, technology, and assets. And the second one is that these centers might be the most ambitious programs in these 2 countries in order to promote university-industry linkages in these systems. And they were ambitious in terms of the size of funding and the time horizons to develop these ideas. So the first approach when I was doing this research was in order to use the broad body of literature about university-industry linkages, benefits, motivations, barriers to interact with each other, and so on. But something was missing to understand fully this phenomena, to try to explain why what these centers of excellence meant for the Peruvian and Chilean systems of innovation, why the actors around these centers were facing particular configurations of barriers, and why international partners of these centers were fulfilling very limited roles as intermediaries between the local needs and the international stock of knowledge and technology. So at that moment was when I turned to Chris Freeman ideas, specifically the concept of national system of innovation, which is a very broad but flexible conceptual framework to understand interactions between different subsystems and different actors, universities, firms, international actors, policymakers, intermediaries, and so on. So I think it was very important for me to understand these dynamics in order to understand how centers of excellence can be studied and explained in the specific context of Chile and Peru, which have weak national systems of innovation. The second idea from Chris Freeman, which was also very useful, was the understanding of innovation as an interactive process of learning. I was coming before the PhD from I was practitioner in in my country, so I used to understand innovation as a result, as a process, as a product introduced in the market. But when I read these ideas of Freeman about this understanding of innovation, very broad, based on capabilities and so on, I had a better view to understand the phenomena I was studying at that moment. The third idea that I can rescue from Freeman that had a strong influence on my research was the relevance of research and technology organizations. I am talking about, for instance, universities in this case, and the relevance of these organizations in the national systems of innovation, the role they play, for instance, in this process of forging ahead and catching up in the theory of technical change, etc. So it also gave me some inputs to interpret my findings and give better recommendations, policy recommendations in my doctoral thesis. And finally, Chris Freeman also highlighted the importance of the international flow of people, technology, knowledge in these processes of development in some countries. So those ideas also were very useful to interpret why international partners of centers of excellence in Peru and Chile were fulfilling very limited roles, and how, if we want to promote international connections, which kind of channels we can promote in order to benefit the most from these kind of interactions. So these four ideas, I can say that were the cornerstone of my interpretation, in the interpretation of my findings in my research. And I would like to finish with a final remark related to how this national system of innovation concept were developed by Freeman and colleagues, which were the interaction between two communities, right? The policymakers community and the researchers community, which I think is amazing, because I would like to do that in the future, right? Coming back to my country with some ideas, trying to build this connection, bridging this gap between policymakers and researchers in order to have better understanding of innovation and innovation issues. So I tried to do that coming back to Peru after the PhD. I didn't succeed, unfortunately. It's very hard because there are very well-established ideas in the system, which is very hard to move. So, but I will be happy to continue trying and to do something related. It's an inspiration what Freeman and colleagues did in this arena. So I would like to do that in the future. With that, I again thank you, all of you, for giving me this opportunity to share my experience. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Pavel. It was very nice to listen to the way you put Chris Freeman's influence in your work, very clear. And I think that we all, in name of Chris, would encourage you not to feel defeated. It is so difficult. And let me tell you, in these troubled times we are living, it's even more difficult. And it has always been difficult in the South. It is also difficult in the North. We are all together working. So these gaps, that is one of the gaps you mentioned between research community and policy community, but also between the power of knowledge and the need of the people. There are so many gaps we need to bridge. And so go ahead. And now, please.
Judith, your microphone didn't work.
Yes, sorry, I don't know what I did, but please, Rhiannon, the floor is yours. The floor, the micro, whatever.
Sorry, I didn't hear. Did you say Jana? Me? Or
No,
Jana?
no, you are the last.
Okay.
I
Jana.
think that yes, please.
Yeah, I'm also hearing Diana, Rhiannon getting mixed up. So that's I think we are interchangeable. So it's no problem. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today, and also thank you to Judith and Gabriela for the initiative to make the special issue, which I think is really lovely to see that come out and to follow all the papers as they go online. The paper that I have contributed to, which is part of this special issue, is co-authored together with Jana, who's here today, and Alexandra Spetskova. And the paper that we wrote was a result of some other work that we've been doing together, trying to see the links between innovation systems thinking that we all know so well, and newer perspectives about ecosystems, and specifically entrepreneurial ecosystems, which we saw in the last 5 years or something was becoming really, really popular. And I think today is really speeding up, and you see papers coming out, especially in management and entrepreneurship journals, a lot about entrepreneurial ecosystems. And when me and Jana and Alex were thinking about these things and talking about these things, we felt like these new ideas were quite linked to systemic way of thinking, but we're not always recognizing these older bodies of literature that we saw them evolving from. So what we really wanted to do was to take these new concepts where everybody was having a lot of buzz around them, that were becoming very popular, both for academicians, but we also saw with policymakers was becoming very popular, for instance, at the OECD. We almost wanted to take a step back and to look back at some classic innovation systems theory and to ask, well, what can we learn from these new ideas, from these older ideas? Because there's this obsession in academia that we always come up with new ideas and new concepts. And we thought maybe it's nice sometimes to stop and reconsider some older concepts and older ideas. So this special issue was a really nice opportunity for us to do that, to take that pause and to go back to some of Christopher Freeman's classic texts, perhaps texts that we haven't thought about since we sat in the Globalix PhD school 8 years ago now, and to actually dig these papers back up and to think about them with fresh eyes. And we actually found that when we try to think about entrepreneurial ecosystems through the lens of looking at the work of Christopher Freeman, there were two things that we thought Christopher Freeman's perspective and his papers were really helpful in clarifying. One of these was context specificity. And this is because in entrepreneurial ecosystem literature, we found that context and place was kind of assumed, but it was not interrogated. And we also found that a lot of the work could be done in quite a narrow range of urban contexts in the global north. And the same case studies were being used. But actually, we didn't know so much about how entrepreneurial ecosystems were functioning in different contexts, both in the global north, such as less well-developed or more rural regions, but also in the global south. And Christopher Freeman's work really shows us how you can do this kind of international comparative studies where you're looking at innovation systems in different countries and trying to understand the differences in their history and their institutions and their cultures and how this influences innovation. So we thought this was a really useful learning to take forward from Freeman's work. And the second thing was the evolutionary dynamics. And we saw that there were some calls being made in the ecosystems literature that the literature needed to become more evolutionary. So it wasn't just looking at what was happening in a snapshot in time, but was seeing how ecosystems evolved. And we knew from our background in the Globalix PhD school, for instance, that the evolutionary way of thinking in economics was at the core of what Freeman was trying to do. And when we went back to his papers, we realized he was doing this on much longer timeframes than we usually see research happening today. And part of that might have been the luxury of the academic system when Christopher Freeman was writing, that you could perhaps take a lot longer on a research project versus today where we get funding for maybe 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. But it was also his big picture thinking and the fact that he drew on history and historical texts and longitudinal thinking to tell his stories about innovation systems. So it was really these two things about the context specificity and looking at different contexts and trying to sort of compare and contrast and understand the similarities and differences between them, but also this evolutionary perspective about looking at how things are evolving over time. That we thought were really important things that we should carry forward into contemporary thinking about ecosystems and not lose these great advancements that was made by the work of Christopher Freeman and the early theorists around innovation systems, just in favor of having a new concept and having a new buzzword. So our paper is really a call for appreciating the old and the vintage ideas and making them trendy again and incorporating them into our new ideas. And I think my time is just about done. So thank you so much for listening and for inviting me to speak today.
Well, you were really very respectful of the time. I think that you have even 1 minute more, but you will have another opportunity, of course, to come back. I would like to thank you very, very much. I think that what you said about the big picture thinking is really one of the framework that Chris gave us. And I would put particularly emphasis on what you say about context specific. This is why we people in this house can learn so much from Chris, because he didn't have the burden of the white man. He didn't try to impose upon us a way of looking into problem and solving problem. Context specific is really something he was very, very, very much aware, and he passed on us. So thank you for that. And now, yes, Diana, I can say it well because it's in Spanish. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Judith. Good morning, everyone. It's morning here in Buenos Aires. So good morning. It's a pleasure being here. My name is Jana Suarez. I'm a professor at National University of General Sarmiento in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I would like to start with a short anecdote about Freeman, how Freeman inspired my work. I remember like almost 10 years ago when I first arrived at Aalborg to do my PhD, I had my first meeting with Ventoke, who was one of my supervisors. I was so excited, wanted to talk about innovative strategies in Argentina, in Latin America, and blah. And I remember Ventoke looked at me like, and then he looked at his library like this, and gave me a lot of books, but half of them were Freeman's work. And I remember when I started deeply reading Freeman, I discovered a lot of concepts that really changed my life. Yeah. And that's why I'm so thankful I was invited to participate in this special issue. When Gabriela and Judith invited us to reflect on Freeman's idea and how they impacted our research, the choice was really easy, really easy. It was congruence and development. Because this concept and this concept of congruence not only impacted my research, but the way I think we should behave. Congruence over time, congruence in our decisions, help to explain how we evolve as human beings. And then Florencia Fiorentin and I decided to base our essay on Freeman's paper, Continental, National, Subnational Innovation Systems, Complementary and Economic Growth, published in Research Policy in 2002. This is a very traditional paper where Freeman wanted to identify key determinants to growth of nation and the level from where those determinants act, meaning national, subnational, or continental. But his conclusions were not traditional at all. He concluded development was about congruence between all those levels, national, local, regional, global, and within each one, between the different subsystems that compose nations. Of course, he was talking not only in quantitative terms, in the sense of quantitative changes, but also and especially qualitative transformations of capabilities and capital. And then congruence Congruency means taking coherent decisions. Decisions about the social subsystem have to be articulated with decisions about market regulations. Decisions about industrial policy have to be coherent with decisions about the educational subsystem. Decisions about science, technology, and innovation policy have to be articulated with decisions about public procurement, and so on. Because the other way around, he continues, the lack of congruence also explains underdevelopment. And of course, he used Latin American countries as examples of what happened if we do not pay attention to congruency. So based on this concept, Florencia and I wanted to think of the COVID crisis and the need for development. What if Freeman had seen the COVID crisis? Because we are confident that Freeman's concept of congruence might help theory and practice with some key elements for a renewed necessary debate. The COVID crisis faces us with a new stage of globalization, the spread of the virus all over the world, the need to worldwide vaccination and new forms of interaction. I mean, we cannot share mate anymore. Call for a necessary renewed debate about the level from where we need to think about development. Not so, and let me say this with all the letters, as we say in Spanish, the evolution of the different national states during the last decade has been proved to be incongruent with global and national sustainability, social and environmental sustainability. The course of our actions during the last decades led us to this global crisis. I mean, several papers have been written and are being written to explain the origin of the COVID virus. But in fact, this pandemic is the best and the saddest example of the butterfly effect. The origin of the virus is not just in Wuhan, whatever the theory you want to believe. It's in the lack of attention to global well-being and the limited impact of supranational and regional organizations in terms of coordination. It's in the way we have conceptualized development. Thinking about development as an economic and national problem led us to this global crisis, which has impacted and will continue impacting our daily life. So, looking ahead, the post-pandemic cannot be a progressive path to what we had before. Development must be a congruent process, congruent in terms of social and environmental sustainability, congruent in terms of institutions that regulate our actions, congruent in terms of how we treat each other, congruent at the global scale. So in this sense, Freeman left us with some clues in that line and warned us about the impact of the lack of global articulation. And I want to invite you to read this paper because 20 years ago, Freeman warned us about this situation, about the possibility of this type of global crisis. He warned about the need for sustainability, about the need for articulation. So it's our duty as academics, of course, but also as citizens of the planet to discuss and get consensus about the type of congruence we need to help building a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jana. I would say that what you have bring us is very, very important. And I would say it is how Freeman is now giving us clues to reflect on the crisis we are living in. We have COVID-19, now we have Afghanistan and Kabul. We are living in very, very troubled times. And I think you are absolutely right that particularly congruence, coherence, loyalty, as he said, being loyal to the ideals of youth, as he said, is really something that is good to have with us in, as I say, these troubled times. Now we come not to the young, but not to the very, very old, but the seniors, that they are going to tell us what they want, but we are expecting them to tell us about Chris as a person, because they have the privilege to having very, very near and strong relationship with him. One of them is Jorge Katz. Jorge Katz has a lot of things to say about him, but now that I have the privilege to working with Jorge, I would like to tell you, if you don't know that he was an economist that went to the shop floor to talk with engineers, to understand from inside what technology is. And he is a brave man, because not every social scientist is able or willing to talk with the people that have the concrete technical knowledge to make change happen. I remember that, and his works and his books about industrial development in Latin America was something that it was a must. I am not an economist, but working in science, technology, and innovation in Latin America, you must read Jorge Katz's book on that. That's for sure. And then we have Slavo Radosevic. And both of them, he used to work in Peru. He is a professor in London. Both of them have one thing in common. They are very loyal to their regions. East Europe, Latin America. This make both of them people that is really nice to hear about what they think, what they feel about Chris. And I would like to give the floor first to Jorge, then to Slavo, and we are listening to you with particular attention and expectation. Please, Jorge, go ahead. Jorge? Well, I don't know what happened with Jorge. He said that he has some problems, some unstable internet connection. Perhaps we can go then to Slavo, please, and then expect that Jorge will solve their problem.
Okay, you hear me well? Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me and honor, because I was one of those people who were privileged to meet Chris relatively early in my career, and then working at Peru and meeting him on a daily, weekly basis, and become really like a family friends. So it obviously shapes you. And when I think about it, what is the kind of, if I was to say to somebody who didn't have that experience, what I see as Chris' contribution, I would say this is first humanity, and this is the economics with values. This is something which attracted me. So when I first read paper, written by Chris, I said, well, my God, I want to meet that person. Why I want to meet that person? Because there's something behind in terms of framework, thinking, values, which attracts you, because this was really economics with values. So if you ask me what is it particular, then I would say it's not one specific issue, but it's more like a philosophical view. How do you look at the economy and society? This is because I was interested, and PhD was on technological change, but here was the man who was looking at the technological change not only as economic process, but as a social, as a political process. And there was this all the time underlying that is a kind of, let's call it economics of hope, because Chris Freeman was a man of the 20th century. So he was really strongly shaped with these alternatives to capitalism, and all his life he was kind of therefore open to new ideas. So he had only one book chapter on Eastern Europe, which I pushed him to write, but he was actually, in terms of thinking all the time within these frames of thinking about the alternatives to the existing systems. So there was all the time this economics of hope behind. And at first time was in a kind of intellectual contact with him. Ben Klogge will remember in 1988, a long time ago, we were in Denmark studying the book Economic Theory and Technical Change, which was this big 1988, Dozy team and Carlotta, everybody was there. And at that time, when Vlogger will remember, we called it Bible. So I produced a journal article paper about the book, which was published in Review of Economic Political Economy, and then sent it to Chris to receive a comment. So that's how we started. And to give you an idea what kind of person he was, that such a broad understanding of the issue. So I was working when I was a SPRU on this book on technology transfer, but I didn't really know how to shape it. I gave it to Chris to read, and then he basically gave me a title and understanding. And then I understood actually what I was doing. This capacity to open himself to everybody and to think in your way. And that is something very rare, academy, we are, meeting of egos, but here was a person who was beyond that. And that is something that the humanism, which that had a chance to meet him, felt privileged in a sense. But because I felt it through his papers, I think that the young people, when you talk about it, that must be something which attracts you. And especially if you read the full kind of range of his papers, which range from more kind of narrow topics to broader, then you will see the perspective which one can call a Freeman's perspective, which really looks in a more holistic way into the overall issue of technological change and the social change. And the more time passes by, we see these shifts in economy going towards the more technical, but then coming back, and there's always these battles going on between different approaches. But I think at the end of the day, his kind of perspective on that, his understanding of technological changes, social, political, and economic, I think this is at the end for me the defining line, and this is kind of what I had picked up as my perspective on that, and as my approach, which I then tried to pass to my younger colleagues. So that is from my side, how I would describe it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Slavo. I think that we all agree that humanity is indeed one of the qualities we most appreciate in Chris. Indeed, for those that had the privilege, even a very small one in my case, to have met Freeman, and you can believe us, you all that only know Freeman by his books, but you can feel it through his writing. Jorge, are you there?
He is there, but he's having problem with his connections. So
okay.
Perhaps we can take somebody from the audience to say something, and then go back to Jorge as soon as he can connect.
I would suggest Jorge not be shy and interrupt anybody that is talking. So just to say, I am here. So we can give him the floor as soon as possible. So I think that we had a very, how could I say it? In German, I would say this Heimisch, like very familiar, some very kind gathering and remembering Freeman. So perhaps someone else want to come and say something about. Perhaps Gabriela yourself, because you said I am not going. Oh,
hola.
Jorge. Perfecto. Go ahead, Jorge.
Hola. ¿Ahora me oyen?
Sí, te oímos bien, dale.
¿Puedo empezar?
Podés empezar, dale.
Gracias, Judith. I would first start by congratulating Judith and Gabby for this wonderful meeting, which has an intergenerational aspect, which I strongly value. I mean, the fact that Judith made it clear that we are now the eldest in this game that are going to share the mic with the first presentations by the young generation, it's for me a very significant element. You will be surprised if I tell you that I met Chris Freeman some 50 years ago. That's half a century. And probably all of the four that started speaking at the beginning of this session haven't even been born at that point. It was in the beginning of the 70s that I first went to Sussex, to Spru, as a visiting fellow, invited by Chris Freeman. And I should perhaps tell you that my previous training before going to Sussex was very much neoclassical. I did my dissertation at Oxford under John Hicks, and whatever economics he taught me, which he did very well, was equilibrium economics, and no institutions to be involved in the analysis. The economic, the price system was capable of directing you towards equilibrium. The first thing that Chris taught me when I got to Spru as a visiting fellow in the early 70s was that an economics without institutions, and an economics which is always leading us towards equilibrium constellations, it's not really what is needed if we are to understand how the world works and what economics is all about. So my first tribute to Chris is as an economist. He allowed me to leave the basic analytical framework, neoclassical, which I was bringing from my training in Oxford, and he led me into Schumpeterian work in which institutions, history, power, and out of equilibrium situations really mattered. And for me, that was the very first realization that economics was not what I have learned in my 4 years at Oxford. So my first tribute to Chris is as an economist. He taught me what economics is all about, and took me out of an scenario of equilibrium and no institutions. My second tribute to Chris is as a professor. He not only taught me what being a professor means, but he, in very different moments, allowed me to understand that the relationship with students is a very personal, very emotional, and very tight relationship, not very much the way economics is being taught today in major universities. The anecdote I have here to convey with you is the day we took the doctoral examination for Gabby, which is one of the organizers of this session. I came to Sussex to be an external examiner of Gabby's PhD dissertation, and I quite remember my lunch meeting before the dissertation took place with Chris in a Sussex University restaurant, cafeteria, and he quite clearly told me, Jorge, I don't know much about Latin America. Please, you guide the session and you conduct the examination, Gabby's dissertation. I remember asking him, well, I will very happily do that, but you will have to allow me to tell Gabby before she starts the dissertation to tell her that she has already been approved, that we only will be asking minor changes to the dissertation. And he very humbly told me, you are the one that conducts the show, so please go ahead. And I can very well remember Gabby's, how she changed her mood when entering the examination room, and the way she conducted her presentation of the thesis in a very lively and a very pleasant form. So my second point is that Chris also told me how to be a professor. A professor relates to his students in a very a personal way, in a very close friend relationship, and not as normally we know people in academia behaving as just giving a class and just letting the students to develop by themselves. And my third and final comment is related to Chris, not as an economist, not as a professor, but as a human being. He also told me a very, very significant lesson as to what it means to relate to other persons in this world, what life is all about. My anecdote here is the last time I met him in his house in Lewis. I was visiting him with Gustavo Crespi. Chris was already having difficulties with his leg and he wouldn't be able to walk. But when we came to his house in Lewis with Gustavo, he had laid the table with a number of exquisite things for us to share with him throughout the afternoon. We spent 7 hours talking with him about many things in the world and many things in academia, and he never stood up from his chair. He told us, all that is there on the table is for you to have, and please go ahead and serve yourself whenever you feel like. The next 7 hours were something which I treasure for the rest of my life. It was a beautiful journey through life and relationships with many people. So these three aspects, Chris as an economist, Chris as a professor, and Chris as a human being, marked immensely my own development. And as I turn 80 at this point, you would realize that I'm talking about things that happened 50 years ago and that I still keep in my soul as a central part of my personal story. This is all I wanted to tell you, Judith, and I thank you very much for this opportunity of sharing these ideas with you all.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Very moving. And yeah, and so the floor is for anybody of you that want to talk about whatever you want, related obviously to our issue today.
Maybe.
I was talking with, maybe, yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, Judith, if you would allow me, I want to just, based on what Jorge said, I want also to clarify myself two things which will probably stay for a long, long time from Chris. This is as I mentioned before, you learn from him that technological change is a social, political, and economic process. And that's easy to say. Everybody will say, yeah, that's we understand it. In principle, yes. But how do you go about it? And that's something which kind of, we're all in different way grappling with that, unless you are kind of really very narrow-minded economists. And that is something which, as some of the students mentioned, context matters in understanding how technology is then and social and political and economic process. And this is where one can draw inspiration from Chris, because he was ultimately fully aware of that, and for him that was not an issue. Jorge had to correct himself and go from neoclassical to more Schumpeterian to learn that. But this is for Chris was a kind of like a natural view how to look at the world. And second thing is this. What I find is this idea of economics of hope, which means today we have a different crisis of capitalism, crisis of environmental sustainability. So there is always a need for economists to contribute to that. So that therefore there is a need for alternative ways of thinking in a new way out of the box. And there where this kind of economics of hope is today especially poignant and important, when we have a big social crisis in moments, then we have to look at the scholars like Chris, who was all the time thinking also about economics in that way. So these are kind of underlying contributions which will stay there. We should stay for a long time. I think that will stay forever. But this is a good a reminder in social sciences, especially in economics, that there are these kind of methodological pillars or philosophical approaches which are more in tune with reality, because we can all play, academic game up to a point, but at the end of the day, if you want to be serious, this is what the social science and economics have to address. And this is where I find all the time then comfort in taking this kind of more Freeman position. So that's my additional clarification. Thank you.
Thank you indeed very much, Slavo. Now the floor is, we have handsome time to talk. Let's profit from it. Who wants to start?
So
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Well, if there is nobody, I'm always ready to come with the questions for young scholars, because I've read all 4 of them. And I have a first question for Chen, if I pronounce correctly, where I liked very much this framework where she tries to do kind of vivisection of Perez Freeman 88 paper. But then there is also something which comes a bit dissonant. She refers to some kind of law of facts in the paper. And obviously, if technology is a political and social process, then facts are exactly interpreted in very, very much different ways. So my question is, what are those law of facts? So that's the first, just to kick the discussion.
Please, Lee, could you answer or reflect upon what Slavo has?
First, I want to say I choose this paper to do a comment because it's relatively short, but it's full of profound things worth tasting for younger scholars. Actually, this 2020 is the first year, was the first year for me for PhD degree. So, so very, very fresh for me. I just want to take the opportunity to give my little contribution to the greatest economist. So the fact for me, especially the debate against the Keynes regression and neglect of technology, the fact because Christopher Freeman and Perez, they focused on the technology and technology development for the growth of the world economy. But in the work of Keynes, his regression and neglect of the technology is not respect the facts. And the second one, Christopher Freeman and Perez, they based on the comparison of the two crises, 1930s and 1980s. This comparing of the facts, they use this way to give a very demonstrative and comprehensive, deeper comprehension of the deeper crisis, structural crisis of adjustments. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Slavo again to make his second question, I have Jana Schmutzler with his hand raised. Do you want to say something, Jana?
Yeah, but maybe it connects to Slavo's question, because I have a question to Pavel on his ideas about the linkages between universities and industry, especially from his perspective, as he said that he was a practitioner before going into research. And in the previous seminars, I think we have talked also about the importance of academics talking to the policymakers, because as long as we keep in our ivory tower and talk only among ourselves, well, we won't have much impact on society. So my question to him is, what would be your suggestion? What can be done with respect to academics talking to policymakers in order, for example, to foster those university industry linkages?
Thank
Before
you,
giving
Jana,
the floor to Pavel,
sorry.
perhaps you can, perhaps you can see that in the chat, there is another question for you from Elias Peraza. And perhaps you can take the question by Jana and these other two, or however you want. Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead,
Thank
please.
you. Thank you, Judith. And thank you, Jana, for the question. I think this is a challenge for every academic, probably not only in the social science sphere, but also engineering and basic sciences and things like that. So what I found hard to do is that what we have is that some ideas are very well established in the system, in the actors around the systems. For instance, we are talking about in Peru, and I think in some Latin American countries, a lot about entrepreneurial universities, right? And people sometimes don't know what that means and how it works, and also talk about a lot of disruptive innovation as the driving factor for development, right? So when you talk about, well, we should do incremental innovations, social innovations, diffusion of innovations, some ideas brought by Freeman as well, it's very hard for them to understand, not only policymakers, as well decision makers in different spheres. So I think what I would like to do, and I'm trying to do now, is trying to be more involved in policy making, becoming a policymaker, or doing consultancies with them, or technical assistance. So I think that's the way. Probably the most effective way would be what Freeman did, right? Is being involved in policy making stuff, being part of the OECD unit of science, technology, and innovation, and trying to push his ideas and his colleagues' ideas as well, in order to make this linkage between these two worlds. So, but is how eager we are to be involved and become policymakers, at least for a while, right? So I think that's my experience as practitioner, as young scholar, let's say. But yes, that would be my answer to your question. So yes, I have Elias 2 questions. if I see if these two communities are approaching or they are distanciating from each other, right? So in some extent, we have, I wouldn't say that I have a right answer here, because in some spheres, you can see there is a kind of approach, at least in Peru, between academics and policymakers. But in other spheres, like a policy industry, for instance, industrial policy here in Peru, they are completely detached. But in some extent, in other areas like probably inclusive innovation or something like that, they are trying to approach to each other, right? So I think it depends. It depends on which aspect of science, technology, and innovation we are talking about, and it also depends a lot of people who are in some positions in government or in some agencies, and also in the other side of the picture in universities and research organizations. So that's my perception about that. I think is what I can say about the questions. Thank you.
Okay, before giving again the word to Slavo to make his second question, I would like, for those that are not Latin Americans or perhaps are not aware, that Pavel is in a very, very special situation, because Peru has a very, very new government. In the chat, it said Pedro Castillo. It is the new president. Is a very strange president for Peru, because he came from the countryside, and is very, very challenges now. So I think that it's not fair to ask to Pavel what the future can be, because it is really in the making, but just to put a little bit in context. Now, that said, please, Slavo, you have another question.
I really don't want to monopolize, but simply I can contact people later on if there is no time. But I have a question for Rhiannon. I like your very much developed contribution, where you are very articulate about the need to bring into entrepreneurship ecosystem concept the context and the evolutionary perspective. So absolutely. So I signed basically most of your paper. My problem, or my question, is with the concept itself. The concept of entrepreneurship ecosystem, and you have this definition from Stam and Spiegel, a set of interdependent actors, factors coordinating in such a way that they enable productive entrepreneurship within a partial territory. My question is, in this definition, how do you define what is entrepreneurship? I wrote with a colleague some time ago critique of this mainstream view on entrepreneurship, where entrepreneurship is defined as a kind of individual activity, and we say there is an entrepreneurial propensity of innovation system. But so there is, you use definition which has entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship is never defined. So my question is, how do you define entrepreneurship in the context of the concept of entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, because this is completely co-authored with Jana, so she might also jump into the response. But I think the answer is how we personally define, and probably a lot of people who work in this sphere, entrepreneurship is probably quite different from most of the people writing about entrepreneurial ecosystems would define it. Because I think they have a more narrow vision of what an entrepreneur is than perhaps we would in this community would discuss it. Because I don't see much discussion in entrepreneurial ecosystem literature of, for example, social entrepreneurship, like bottom of the pyramid entrepreneurship, necessity entrepreneurship, these kind of things. And part of what we did that might be interesting to some people here, as well as writing this paper, me and Jana and Alex, we've had actually one book, which is called Innovation Systems Meets Entrepreneurial Ecosystems. And we've had two special issues, one in the journal called Local Economy and one in the journal called Growth and Change. And in these, we've basically tried to open up the debate about entrepreneurial ecosystems with more broader perspectives. And there's been a lot of contributions in those from the Global X Network and people contributing case studies from all around the world to try and actually broaden this concept of entrepreneurship, what makes an entrepreneurial ecosystem, to try and be more inclusive. because our feeling is like, I think maybe you're getting to this with your question, that the entrepreneurial ecosystem community is either not defining it very well, or they define it in a very narrow view. But I might pass over to Jana because she might have a different take on it.
No, I completely agree with you, and we've discussed it quite a few times. So generally speaking, most entrepreneurial scholars, when they talk about entrepreneurship, they probably refer to the definition of Chen and Venkataraman in 2000, where they say that entrepreneurship is the process in which opportunities are to create new goods and services are explored, evaluated, and exploited. However, as Rhiannon just explained, that's a relatively narrow definition of entrepreneurship, in most cases excluding elements such as she just mentioned, social entrepreneurship, bottom of the pyramid entrepreneurship. So we understood it in all of the works that we have done as something there where you are not only trying to exploit an opportunity, but it also includes action taking based on and now I'm lacking the words on things that present themselves, and you might see them as opportunities, but when you talk about opportunities, usually you think about the big ideas of high tech and these kind of things. But an opportunity might also be, well, I can sell food on the street corner because this way I can earn a living. So it's very much in a very broad way understood in the work that we are doing.
Okay. There is a provocation to Professor Lundvall in the chat. I don't know if Professor Lundvall wants to take the provocation on board.
Okay, I can do that. No, I mean, the concept innovation ecosystem appeared in the United States. It was one of the most influential contributions was by a female scholar from National Science Foundation. And I mean, when it appeared, I had a strong feeling that, and there was no reference to innovation systems. And I had this strong feeling that what they needed was a concept which did not have the political connotations of a strong state. They wanted to present something which have grown by itself, like an ecosystem, like a natural system, without any major power relationships. And so this is why I'm slightly critical. It's a somewhat nebulous concept, and I think they are missing some very important dimensions, which are, I mean, I recognize that you enter into this some of the old ideas with a long historical perspective and comparative perspective, but it's not only that missing. I think there are some other things, but I mean, you shouldn't be too sectarian. I'm sure that a lot of new insights have been produced with the use of this concept. So, and the other thing I think about entrepreneurship, and this will be my last remark, is that the core entrepreneurship literature is about individual choices, in a sense. While a lot about the innovation system is about, as somebody else said, interaction, and actually what I would like to call collective entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matoke.
Thank you.
The floor is open. The micro is open. if nobody is going to say something, I am not sure if we can jump from one issue to another, but let me tell you the following. I am not an economist. I have discussed that with my great friend Jorge Katz so many times when he said the profession, and I said to him, it's not my profession. Okay, so I would like just to say that for me, Chris Freeman was obviously an economist, but he was a deep sense, a social scientist. And I want to remind you about two pieces. One of it is in the Economic of Hope, is the first chapter on Bernal. And perhaps you should go and see when he passed away, it was a video of him that was put in internet when he talks about Bernal. And he said, the first time I met him, it was like opening a window and let enter fresh air. His admiration for the historical power of Bernal explanation. As you know, Freeman was a Marxist. He was a materialist. Bernal was a Marxist, much more dogmatic that Freeman was. Freeman was not dogmatic at all. And in this chapter, there is a critique of the dogmatism of Bernal that really gives you a sense of how to relate to history. This is one of my ways of looking into Freeman like a social scientist. And the second one is back in time, in the early 70s. His reaction when the Club of Rome, the Meadows, wrote The Limit of Growth, he was absolutely furious. And he wrote this wonderful and almost neglected piece of work that is called Malthus with a Computer. And at the same time, at that time in Latin America, Amilcar Herrera, a geologist, was doing in Bariloche what is called el contramodelo mundo, the counter-world model against the Club of Rome report. And the idea was, if you change the equations, if you change the values you put into the variables, you are going to have a different future. And he made a huge effort, and he met Chris in Peru to discuss both approaches. And that's really something that shows you how deeply involved Chris was in 50 years ago, more than 50, 60, almost 60 years ago. What I'm saying, no, 50 years ago, on this kind of global issues. And in this sense, what Jana, the exercise Jana made, what would have said Freeman now in this COVID-19 crisis is a nice exercise. It's a nice exercise. What would Chris Freeman said in this state of the world? He has said a lot, but things are changing so rapidly. I wouldn't say that for good. So just because you are silent, this is why I take the microphone, but now I promise I am not going to take it anymore. So please go ahead.
Can I add something?
I
want to thank Freeman for training you. I mean, because all the time I'm saying I'm not that kind of economist. I'm not that kind of economist. There are economists with social conscious, and that's because our professors, were you working with them, Judith, Val, Jorge, Gabriela, Carlota, there are many people. He trained so many people, and his legacy is among you, and I'm grateful I can say I'm that type of economist, thinking in terms of global development, thinking in development beyond economic terms, thinking of growth of nation in terms of well-being. And I think that's one of the things we have to thank Freeman for. And thank you, of course, for giving this opportunity to produce knowledge in such an open way that we can exchange ideas and discuss and reflect all together in this intergenerational way of building and producing knowledge.
Our friend from l'Université de Lille, Professor Hetler, wanted to say something. Are you there? Gabriela?
It's not connected. That's what Gabriela said.
It's not connected. Okay.
Yeah. I would like to follow up on what Diana and what you said, and that is related to Diana's presentation. I was hoping that she will emphasize it more, but she refers to this Freeman's, I think it's 2000 paper on these congruence and different subsystems. And if you read it carefully, then Freeman says additional subsystem, which should be included in understanding the kind of this alignment of different subsystems when it produces either high growth or dramatic change, should be also environmental system. And then I'm reading it kind of 2021, and I said, well, this is what he wrote 20 years ago, you know, kind of. And today for us, that is obvious. That is obvious that the environment sustainability is such a big factor that will influence everything around. And this is actually follows from the Chris methodological position. So if you ask me what he would do today, I would say he wouldn't have problem, you know, in following and developing ideas on looking at that as important subsystem in society and how that subsystem will influence, will shape, and will be shaped by the other subsystem. And that is indeed this kind of understanding of technological change as a social and political process. So I think it follows there from just that one additional para which stares at you and you cannot ignore it. So yeah.
Bentoke, you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to add a few words on my comments because ecosystem. I haven't read the paper by Jana, and now I have to do it. I mean, what I refer to is a kind of just, you know, reaction on the kind of literature on systems in United States as compared to other countries, and that has, by the way, changed completely. Now, there's no doubt that the US is fighting very hard to build a strong national innovation system with the help of the state. So, just to moderate my comment, and when I have the floor, I'm rereading a couple of papers by Chris. One of them is about Japan, and the other one is the one that Diana referred to about continental regional systems, etc. I think what I learned from this is, I think I can put it quite briefly, that in the Japanese study of the Japanese innovation system, you have an exemplary idea of the present as history. Because actually Chris is writing about Japan, not how it was 20 years ago. Of course he goes back, but he goes up today, and it actually results in underestimating some of the problems that were inherent in Japan. But that's one of his so to say method. The other method is in the other paper, where he used concepts from, I would call, economics of innovation or political economics of innovation to understand history. And finally, it's obvious whatever he does in both these things, he's doing it in order to change the direction of history. He's doing it in order to change reality. So you have this kind of paradox that He's more historical, taking long view than most social scientists. And he links history and social science very closely together at the same time as he's very action-oriented. He wants to change the world. And this, I think, is the unique characteristic of Chris Freeman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mtoke. Very inspiring. I don't want to push anybody to talk. If nobody, if you want to chat, okay.
Carlota is raising her hand.
Excellent. Excellent.
Jana and Gabriela.
And Rhiannon as well. So
Rhiannon,
perfect. Perfect. I didn't see that, but now I see it. Okay, so Carlota.
We are not hearing Carlota.
I want to continue a bit on Pavel's discussion of the relationship between academics and policymakers. I have been sustaining for a long time that one of our main problems in Latin America, and I imagine it's the same thing in the other developing countries, is that even though we're training a lot of people in the sort of thinking that Chris promoted and that we're all talking about now, all naturally, we all think that's how the world is. But many people who have been trained in innovation studies actually go back not to innovation policy posts, but to academia. And within academia, they end up writing in English because it's the only way to go up in the ladder. So the policymakers, they don't necessarily speak English, and the papers don't necessarily relate to the policymakers' problems. Having been a policymaker myself and having tried to get the, there weren't many innovation policy trained people, but trying to get the academic people, except of course Judith, which was then there, and she was worrying about the real world. But it was very difficult to get academics to do the things because the conditions under which academics work, the things that are required of academics, don't fit the needs of the policymakers. I wanted the results in 1 month at most. Every academic said, it takes me a year. Why does it take you a year? Because in order to be able to publish, you have to have a type of information with your research that is not done in a month. But for a policymaker, you need a reply immediately. So then we have this profession of the consultant, which is like this, you know, in the Slavo project and all that, they were studying about these gatekeepers and various other people that played that role of connecting knowledge possessors with knowledge users in the policy world. But I feel that we are very far from understanding, first of all, what the policymakers' needs are. Secondly, we don't know how innovation happens in institutions. We have a lot of information about how innovation happens in industry, in the market. But how about in policy? How about even how do political action changes? How do the NGOs do their work? How does innovation happen in the real world, in the social sphere, in the institutional sphere? Why don't we study this? And again, I find that the obstacle is the academic conditions and the academic requirements. Young people in the academic world today, when they're going to do a thesis, they have to have data and a theoretical model. And the data and the theoretical model are not the way that Chris would have said, go talk to the people directly. Go inside the actual world that you want to explain. And get the data, not necessarily that blind data that's a lot of numbers and you don't know what's behind it. but rather the data about the actual things. You know, he had a lot of graphs and a lot of data in his articles, but they were all about, you know, plastic innovations and this and, you know, the actual things, not just numbers. So somehow academic requirements are stopping people from being relevant. They're stopping us from discovering how to change. We are at a time of enormous change. We are in a structural transition that covers every single aspect. The 5 spheres that Chris talks about: culture, technology, politics, science. Can't remember the other one. Did I mention technology? Technology, science, culture, politics, and economics, of course. The economy. missing the one. Anyway, this transformation requires understanding how change happens. And this is in the advanced world and in the developing world. We need to understand that. Why aren't we doing it? Do we have to start by changing the academic conditions so that people can do what we need them to do? Do we need to connect the academic and the policy world in some structural way and not just expect it to happen naturally? Do we need some dissemination institutions that will actually go and look at what's successful and then work with other people to make it successful and then understand why it was successful, like the Slavo project, but in institutions? I am very worried about this whole thing, about what's happening to us and what's happening to young people that are, you know, the conditions, the oppression that they suffer. You know, you have to publish so much and you have to publish in this way and journals required in this other way, but the world needs you and you can't serve it. So does anybody know what we could do? Is this an insoluble problem? Can we really use all the theory, all the ideas? You know, Chris used to work with the real world and constantly really find what to do. Even when he worked in the Frascati manual, he was worrying about what to do, how to push science spending. You know, how to push it. You have to know how much there is and you have to compare so that people will want. So then he went and designed how to measure it so you would then increase it. He wasn't measuring it for the sake of measuring. He was measuring in order to push people to increase spending in science and technology when he did the Frascati manual. So this sort of problem, I would really like us to somehow never lose sight of it. Never lose sight of the fact that all this innovation studies, all this understanding, all that, it's to change reality, as we've all been saying. We understand that, but are we changing it? Are we really working? Do we dare? Because the academic world doesn't let you talk about what could be done, what might be going to happen. You know, because you're supposed to work about the past, but you don't go far enough in the past. It's just the past 20 years, something like that. All those things are very worrisome for me. And I would like, first of all, I would like to know whether other people coincide with this worry. Do you recognize this problem as a real problem? And can you think of a way that we could improve the situation?
Absolutely great.
Yeah.
And I am not going to say anything because if not, I am going to take the floor, which I'm not going to do. So I think that other people have prices.
If I can
go Slavo. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can follow on Carlota, because I'm one of the few people who lives that frustration that she is describing. Because I work at university, which is driven by the scientific excellence. And then at the same time, I'm deeply immersed in a policy world, but deeply, deeply. When I say deeply, then it is deeply. And I think that the main challenge is within the academy definition, what is considered as scientific excellence? And that is a really serious question. What is considered? And I think there are already signs that is external criteria of scientific excellence, different matrices, that this is basically now gradually abandoning. My university is now openly abandoning that, finally, thanks God, kind of, which offers hope that the future academic contributions will also meet criteria of social relevance, kind of, and have a kind of dialogue. From my own experience now, I actually learn more about the issues doing policy work than looking at the data, working with colleagues who are econometricians. I learned much more. To give you an example, and this is related to what Pavel was presenting, I was looking now at the science industry linkages in two countries, which you never heard maybe of, Moldova and Uzbekistan. And then I was shocked to see a sea of literature on science industry linkages, which do not relate to these kind of semi-developed middle-income, low middle-income economies. All that is a kind of, for some other world, highly irrelevant. Why? Because there was no this groundwork done. There was no kind of understanding of the basic facts of the situation. Not everything. Of course, there are some colleagues here whom I actually use then and inspired by them because they look at the situation of similar countries. But most of the work is basically driven by this idea that there is some universal concept and then we just apply it. Well, actually, it is the context and which dominantly matters. And this is also now becoming, I think, increasingly clear in terms of methodology. So I'm more optimistic that at the end of the day, it's a human curiosity, dissatisfaction, also the limits of the producing idea that there are some general laws in society which is so much context dependent. So I'm a bit more optimistic that there is a process, is extremely slow, and I feel extremely pity for our young colleagues, and I would be very frustrated in that situation that I have to meet the criteria of external metrics and not thinking about the social relevance of my work. So when I have a PhD student, then the student says, oh, I would like to do on some problem to solve something. And I cynically, ask, but who is interested in that? Academy is not interested in that. So this is more to kind of put him on the ground rather than to discourage him. But there is this huge gap, but I'm hoping, and I think as long as we define better what are the criteria of scientific excellence, especially in social sciences, will be on a better ground because we are producing a lot of poor social science. That is what we are doing for the time being.
Thank you very much. And I think Ryan and Jana wanted to say something. Please, Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, briefly.
Hello, Judith.
Sorry, who was there?
Hello, Judith. Finally I got back into the screen.
Okay.
I've been following the discussion through my cellular phone. I got some of the ideas, but I am now back in the screen with access to my audio. At some point, if you're not finishing already the meeting, I would like to say something.
Perfect. Let's listen to Ryan and then Jana and then you, Jorge. Okay, go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Judith.
So the first thing that there were two things that I wanted to say in response to the last few comments. The first one was what Carlotta was saying. Do we have any ideas of how we can, make the research more impactful and more speaking to policymakers? And it was to let you know about something we are trialing this autumn in Circle. For those of you that don't know, the Center for Innovation Research at Lund University, where I work. We also had this feeling and we thought we make all these long, maybe a bit boring articles that policymakers are not going to have time or inclination to read. What can we do about this? And we had this idea to do the 2-minute policy read. So we take an article and then we have a template. So then we write a very, very short policy focused summary of this, which we then put on the Circle website with the working paper series, which then has the link to the full paper. So if they're really interested to find out more, they can go to get the full picture. So I would say if anybody thinks that they would like to contribute to this new initiative and they have some research that they would like to translate into 2-minute policy reads, then please get in touch with me, because we're actually trying to find people to get this initiative started. So that was like the practical thing that I wanted to share with you. And if you can obviously do a Google, and my university page will come up and it will have my university email, and you can just write to me if you want to be involved. Welcome. The other thing was, that I think was quite funny from what you're all talking about, was a conversation that we were having, me and Jana and Alex, when we were reading these papers by Freeman. And we were saying, wow, like we can't publish like this today, because what he was writing, he seemed to have so much freedom in the style of writing, in the way that he was, you know, using these really historical things, and he was bringing in lots of different kinds of information. And it feels like now, if we want, and you know, he was writing in these top journals like Research Policy. And it feels like now, if you want to publish in these kind of places, you have to have these papers that are just like in this formula, and it's so tight. And I think this is what Carlotta was talking about a bit, like it's become so formulaic, but we don't necessarily feel like we have many options to write in a free way or to say things in a different way, because a bit like what Slavo was saying, like we're all, you know, postdocs or junior faculty, and we need to get tenure, and, you know, we need to have jobs. And to do that, we have to have these publications. And we were feeling like jealous of this kind of like this golden era of Freeman, when he could like write these long papers and all these ideas. And like, I just wanted to share that anecdote, that this was something we were talking about, but from the other perspective, like, wow, these guys had it so good back in the good old days. And I'm sure it's not that simple. I'm sure there were lots of problems also in the good old days, but it felt a bit like that to us.
I would like to say, Brian, that I'm sorry to tell you that you will need to fight against what you just talked, because you are the young one. We, the older, we are also fighting. I think that Carlotta said, and what you said describes one of the big battles, intellectual battles of this time, because they are just killing. They are killing science, not only social science. They are killing science to coup. And this is really very, very important. But if this is going to be a political fight, and one hard one. So let's get strong. Jana, and then please.
Yeah, just one short comment with respect to the comment that Bengt Ake made. Of course, we did not understand it as a critique. Quite on the contrary, I think these kind of conversations between different streams of literature need to be taking place much more often. And that's exactly what we try to do in our work. And what you mentioned with respect to the impression that you had, how the entrepreneurial ecosystem emerged as an idea where the state needed to be seen as something not strong, but rather the focus on the individual agency, is one of the things that we actually are criticizing in several of the things that we did in the past, that even in entrepreneurial ecosystem, depending on the kind of context, and going back to the contextualization that Rhiannon mentioned, it's not necessarily only based on individual agency. So your comment makes absolutely sense to all of what we've done in the past with respect to the research of trying to bridge entrepreneurial ecosystem and innovation system. And with respect to the comment of Carlotta, I think it's something that all drives us. And as Rhiannon said, we have discussed it a lot. And living in a developing country in Colombia, but having been raised in a developed country, one of the things that really bugs me, especially about Colombia, is the adherence of policymakers not to their local people, but always go to the US to ask for advice. So just now, a few weeks ago, the international mission of what should be done in Colombia with respect to industrial policy was finished with a report where the report was led by Ricardo Hausmann. And of course, he is a great economist, and I don't question his insights, but we have lots of good economists also in Colombia, but they're never asked. So adding to what we just said, I think another issue that comes into play, especially when we talk about developing countries, is how can we try to convince policymakers that instead of always going and looking outside of their own country, to rely also on their local talent.
Great point, Jana. It links to the imaginaries that Sábato and Botana wrote about more than 60 years ago. Great issue. But it's so good that all these things have came up in this discussion. You see, the invisible hand of Chris is around here. Okay, Jorge, it's your turn.
We might have lost him. I was going to suggest that we should have let him go immediately.
Yeah. Perhaps you are right. Jorge.
But maybe he can go.
Jorge, puedes hablar.
I will do it again through my cellular phone. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes,
go ahead.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry about the connection. I don't know what is happening to my connection, but I lost part of the discussion, which was quite interesting. I would like to add a few things. We are really at a turning point in which much of the economic policy making, which has taken place over the last 2 decades, which was basically supported by Washington consensus ideas of short-term fiscal equilibrium, are really melting away because of the pandemic. I mean, what the United States and Europe are doing at this stage is returning to Keynesian policies, expanding rapidly social expenditure, and bringing up a new set of policy issues which, during the Washington consensus period and macroeconomic fiscal equilibrium, short-term fiscal equilibrium, are gradually disappearing from the debate. This is not really happening in Latin America still, where much of the policy discussion in Brazil or in Colombia or in Mexico or in Chile still is standing on a short-term fiscal equilibrium. Now, it's interesting that while this is happening, the institutional development is not following pace with what is rapidly taking place in biological, genetics, digital developments and so forth, in which a great deal of new innovation is taking place in the region in relation to natural resource base. This is an area in which Carlota is strongly working, and I usually share with her a number of pieces of information which show that a very modern new sector is developing in many of the Latin American regions on the basis of these digital, biological, genetics, and artificial intelligence issues. Now, I have to say that the institutions are not following the same pace as the strong process of change that is taking place at the technological front. So we have a real problem here in which policymakers and institutions are not really very much aware as to how the basic technology of society is undergoing changes due to new biological, genetic, and digital developments at the technological frontier. This very much takes us back to disruptive innovation, which was very much the Schumpeterian way of looking at this, and what was Freeman way of looking at this. And this dissonance, a cognitive situation in which institutions go behind the development of the technological frontier are introducing tension in the policy formulation in Latin America. Now, it's interesting that in developed countries, Keynesian ideas are coming back, and the state is taking back the role of acting as a dynamic source of change, very much in the way Bentoke was talking a few minutes ago. This is not still the case in many of the Latin American countries, in which the old ideas of short-term fiscal equilibrium are still prevailing among our policymakers. Now, this dissonance between what's going on in the technological and knowledge frontier with new science-based activities in resource processing sectors is going to continue, while slowly institutions will have to come back to a realization that they are running behind what is going on in the technological frontier. So this dissonance, which was very much the way in which Chris looked at the world, and in which the Schumpeterian idea of disruptive innovation created a vision of how capitalism changes, it's probably going to take the next 1 or 2 decades until we realize that institutions are not keeping up with the development of the technological frontier. I know that Carlota is very much involved in discussions of this sort, and I understood the conversation by Slavo and by Bentoke as implying that this new entrepreneurship that is taking up strong developments in the knowledge frontier and trying to come up with indigenous innovations in many of the Latin American countries is still not understood by policymakers and by most of the economic profession.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorge. I see that Bentoke has his hand raised. Is that so, or? Bentoke?
Yes, I very much agree with what Jorge was saying. And I think the demand for kind of knowledge input into the policy process in the area of science, technology, innovation, and institutional change, that this demand will increase everywhere. What Jorge was talking about is that there is a certain delay, it takes some time, but I think it will happen. We had a very unique situation around 1995 in Denmark. We had some very progressive people at the top of the Ministry of Industry. And what we could do there was actually to co-finance. We had out of 4 PhD processes, they financed 2. And what we did was actually to locate the 2 PhD students within the ministry for half a year, working directly with the people. And of course, this was a very unique and ideal situation, but of course, it had an enormous impact. They developed a new development program for Denmark on this basis. What happened was then that they changed government before it was realized this is what's happening. So the neoliberal came too, but it is just to say it's not necessarily so that you only have to have 2-minute communication. I think to try to get policymakers very closely integrated in research-like work is one thing we should try to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bentoke. You are talking things that are very, very much in tune with something I am failed miserably to implement in my country, but I realize clearly the power of this idea. I think that we are now 5 minutes left to our finish, and I would like to thank everybody for a very, very interesting, and I'm sure that we are going to think about this session in the days to come. And thanks Gabriela and for all his effort, and Raje and Jana for this wonderful organization, this idea of mixing young people with not so young people, and to talk together and to see how things go on intellectually. And I think that Freeman would be really glad to know how his legacy is being managed by the people that admire him so much as we do. So now I would like to ask Jana to say the finishing words of this session. Please, Jana, go ahead.
Even though you already said very nice finishing words. But thank you, Judith. I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who has participated in setting up this wonderful seminar series. Judith and Gabriela, who had the fantastic idea of the special issue, which was at the root of this seminar, and the group of young scholars that are linked to the GlobalX community who through the first IS Chris Freeman lecture series that already took place at the beginning of this year have started an initiative to honor Chris and to honor Chris in a way that I think has come through in all of these 3 seminars that we have, through giving voice to younger scholars. I think that's a very unique characteristic of GlobalX. When I joined GlobalX, it was in 2013 through the PhD school. I was really astonished and amazed by the atmosphere that was taking place at the PhD school, where senior scholars interacted without any kind of barriers with the junior scholars, something that at that moment I wasn't aware is not normal, is not common in most academic areas in a way that it is in GlobalX. And through these kind of relationships that we have built during the PhD schools, various things have emerged. So the group of people who are behind, of young people who are behind the organization of these seminars, we have gotten to know some of us quite some time ago. Some of us, we just got to know each other now during this year while organizing these kind of seminars. So thank you all to that group of people who are behind the scenes and not always mentioned. And again, to Judith and Gabriela for organizing the special issue. And to all the speakers that have participated, both juniors and seniors during the past weeks. If you want to know more about us, there's a webpage. It's www.chris-is.org. As we're currently organizing a second lecture series where, again, we give voice to junior scholars to talk about how they put theory on innovation system into practice in their own research. Thank you all, and hope to see you soon again in one of these seminars.
Thank you, Jana. Gabriela, would you just say goodbye to all of us?
Yes, well, I think that it was a very rich interaction between different generations of the same community along 3 webinars during August. It was very interesting, the point that they were set in relation to academic topic, but also in relation to anecdotal personal experiences. That the idea was try to combine both dimensions. And all this contributes to build community. And Chris was at the center of this community and continued to be generating inspiration to all of us. We have to say thanks, first of all, to Carlota and Kaplinsky, because the original idea of having a special issue came from them in an email that Kaplinsky sent to us with Carlota. And we have to say thanks also to the journal, no? Innovation and Development, because they opened us the opportunity to organize this very interesting special session that will be in print very, very soon. And also, obviously, to Globelix, who also is at the center of all of our activities. And then thanks to everybody, it was really a very interesting space.
Okay, Judith, hello. Judith, are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Judith?
yes, we are. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I think it was from Globelix side and also from the journal side when the proposal came. In fact, I was a little bit, disappointed in the sense that research policy will be bringing out full-length research articles, especially issue, and innovation and development will be bringing forth essays or reflections from the younger scholars. I was initially little upset about the thing because in the journal, we never publish, we are only full-length research articles. This is for the first time we have made an exception in terms of publishing not full-length research articles. But today, I feel that it was really a right decision by the editorial board to give green signal to Judith and Gabriela. And by all standards, the young scholars have risen to the to everyone's expectation. And I feel that this is not an end, but it is only a beginning. Also, I often used to wonder, I think something for further reflection. You know that India is a country which upheld the role of science, technology, and innovation as early as in the mid-50s. I often used to wonder why there was no Chris effect in India, very limited Chris effect, except Ashok Parthasarathi, with whom I had the fortune of working with him. And it's a long story. But other than that, I didn't find anyone, any major S&D, science and technology scholar, innovation scholar from India, really kind of getting influenced. While scholars like Nicholas Calder, you name anyone for that matter, they have come and spent time in India. And I often used to, but in Latin America, I understand that Chris had much more impact. I wish Chris had greater impact on India, but I'm very, very happy that Chris had created a huge not only the knowledge capital, the human capital, and the capable friends like Benda Kelunduar and all around. And that thanks to them, now today innovation system, they are all, Chris is speaking through maybe thousands of mouths, thanks to his great friends, and the people whom he created. So that is something that we all should be essentially learn from Chris, in the sense that what more than what you write, or equally what you write. And when Slavo was talking about how friendly he was to the students and also Jorge to his students, this is a great lesson that we must be learning, and that we should be able to, unless if you are able to live through your students, that's going to be a great lesson that we should be picking from, learning from Chris. So I must thank the whole Globelix community, and particularly my scientific board, and also my editorial board members, and particularly the editors of the special section, for this remarkable job. Above all, the young scholars, Jana, Suri, Rajesh, and others, I think they did an incredible job. So looking forward to seeing more from young generation, because you are going to lead the way. Many of the people who spoke and are actually the fag end of the career. You have a great responsibility to take the agenda forward. By wishing you all the best, thank you very much.
Okay, see you then.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks to Jana
Bye-bye.
and Rajesh. Fantastic work.
Bye, Gabi and
Jorge.
Jorge.
Bueno, ya